can hear me in the back there, I think I'll speak without the mic. If you can't hear me, raise your hand.
Now wait a minute. If you can't hear him, raise your hand.
That's a good one. Good start. Hard to top. I flew 35 missions in the P-51 Mustang. And I thought I'd like to tell you about one of them, which was kind of different. But before that, I feel compelled to make a few comments about you bomber guys. You know, it was with considerable admiration as well as sympathy that I sat up there. I'm up here and you're straight and level toward the target through that wall of flak, and I'm sitting up here tooling around and no flak's chasing me. Also, I've heard your comments about how cold it got at altitude in the bomber. I'm warm and comfy in my heated cockpit, feeling almost guilty, but I'm also impressed with your stories about losing an engine, losing 2 engines, or in the case of Larry, losing 3 engines, and getting back to land the plane. Partly I'm impressed because when I lost an engine, I glided like a streamlined brick. It was February 9, 1945, and I was scheduled for the mission. My plane was out for repairs, so I borrowed a plane from a buddy, and we're in close formation, climbing over the channel, when all of a sudden I had a total loss of power. I called we're at 12,000 feet by then. I called the squadron leader, said I got a little engine problem. He said, how serious is it? I said, well, I think it's kind of serious. I got 0 oil pressure and no power. So, like I said, I'm gliding like a streamlined brick, and I'm at 7,000 feet, getting smoke in the cockpit, and so I said, I'm out of here. Now, anybody knows that the best way to bail out of a fighter plane is to unhook your seatbelt, pop your canopy, roll over and drop out. But with the smoke in the cockpit, I was kind of anxious to get out of there. I just pushed up out of the seat, and it was like a great big hand reached out and grabbed me. It's 200-mile-an-hour slipstream, you know. And so once I got my body partly out, I was just whipped out of there. So I'm floating down in a parachute, and I'm looking down at that cold channel water, and we've been briefed, you know, about how cold it was in the North Sea and the Channel. We've been told we had about 3 minutes to get into our dinghy if we got after we got into the water. So I didn't have much desire. This is February. I didn't have much desire to take a cold bath, and so I thought I'll pull the shroud lines toward the shore. Of course, the manual tells you not to do that because you could collapse a parachute. But by pulling the shroud lines and with a strong west wind, I was able to make the coast of Belgium, and I landed in an open field right near the coast. There was a small village right near me, about 20 or 25 people standing out there at the edge of the field and the edge of the village. Nobody came out to meet me. So I rolled up the parachute in a ball and I walked out to where the people were. The guys were shaking my hand, and women were hugging and kissing me like I just won the war. So I gave them my parachute. And about then, the car pulled up with two British Navy officers. The first thing they said to me was, "Do you know you just walked out of a minefield?" So now I knew why nobody walked out to me. The Navy guys took me, well, they asked me if I was okay, and I said, well, I kind of hurt my knee there. I got a lot of pain in my knee. So they took me to a local doctor, and he checked me out, and he said, you'll be okay, you just strained your knee. Gave me a glass full of cognac. I said, what's this? He says, it's painkiller. And he was right. In a short time, I was feeling no pain. The next morning, I caught a British lorry to Ghent, from Blankenberg to Ghent. Ghent is kind of a rail center. And the British gave me a pass on the train to Brussels, where I was going to catch an ATC plane and get back to England. They brought me down to the station. There must have been 200 people standing on the platform waiting for this train. And I thought, this better be a pretty big train to put all these people on it. And pretty soon up chugs a locomotive and one little passenger car. And I said, there's no way I'm going to make it on this train. But lo and behold, the crowd parted and they shoved me up to the front. Somehow, some way, I don't know how, the word had passed that if we're going to win the war, I had to get back to England. So, anyway, I managed to get on that train, and pretty soon it was wall-to-wall people, standing room only. But we got to Brussels on the train, and a British Jeep picked me up at the station and brought me to the airport, and I got on a C-47 and got back to base. And I found my buddy who had so graciously given me his plane. He said, gee, Bob, I'm sorry I just lost your plane for you. He said, don't worry about it. He says, I've had nothing but trouble with that thing. I said, now you're talking. Well, you know, you'd think that any pilot should be entitled to this kind of thrilling experience only once. Wrong. I'm flying over Scotland in my own plane one day, and I saw little globules of oil on the canopy. And I knew from previous experience that that 51 doesn't go too far without oil. So I looked down, there's a RAF field almost right below me. So I scooted down there and got to the end of the runway. And, you know, you don't see too good through a windshield full of oil. So I cracked the canopy about 8 inches and peeking out the side there, got it on the runway. As I'm taxiing into the hangar, the engine quits. I was 3 days on that base waiting for another engine, which I didn't mind too much. I was playing pool with the Australian and Canadian pilots for 3 days. But, you know, I mentioned earlier how treacherous the North Sea was for if you had to get down into it. And one day we were headed for Target, and I had a wingman named Eddie Hassel. We're over the North Sea heading for Target. He says, I got engine trouble, I'm going back to base. On the way back from the target, we got a call from home base. Said, look for an oil slick out there where the boy went down this morning. I thought, uh-oh, that's Eddie. And of course we didn't find any oil slick. But the important part about, the interesting part about this story is that the night before we had talked about if you had engine trouble over the water, whether to bail out or whether to ditch and try to get into your dinghy. They told us we had 3 minutes in the water there, or you'd get numb. Anyway, Eddie said, I think I'd try to ditch because I'm a good swimmer. I was on the high school swimming team. Well, nobody will ever know why it didn't work for Eddie, but Eddie was gone. Another time I was flying a wingman for a guy named Bob August, and we were over Eastern Germany. And Bob called and said, I got engine trouble. I said, you want me to go back to base with you? He said, no, I can't make it to base. I'm going to head for the Russian front. And I said, good luck. That's the last we saw of Bob. We found out he was KIA, but we never knew whether the Germans or the Russians got him. We knew we couldn't trust the Russians because a guy in my squadron named Ken Horner was getting shot up pretty good by a Russian yak until the guys chased him off. Ken made it part way back to base and bailed out. But there's no way, in my opinion, that Russian pilot could mistake a P-51 for an Me-109 with that big air scoop on the bottom of the P-51. So I think he was either weak-eyed or mean-spirited. And that was the only experience that we had with the Russian pilot, but it wasn't very pleasant. Most of my missions were bomber escort, stay with the bomber in and out. Occasionally, they would permit us to go down and find targets of opportunity, which might mean an airfield, a locomotive, a truck. To some guys, it meant anything that was moving. And I came back from a strafing mission one day, uneventful, I thought, until the crew chief showed me a hole in the cowling, lifted the cowling, and showed me a nick in the coolant pipe. And, you know, P-51 was vulnerable to to low-level small arms and to low-level flak. And I suppose that's why they didn't allow us to go down and strafe very often. Toward the end of the war, our greatest danger in the skies was the Me-262, the German jet. The 51 was the best plane we had, but we often wished we'd had a jet. They could fly higher than we could, and they could fly faster than we could. We had the opinion that anytime they wanted to, they could come out of the sun and pick a guy off and keep right on going. A guy named Radley in my squadron was picked off just that way. And never had a chance, didn't even have a chance to bail out. I often wonder what might have happened if Hitler had listened to the advice of his generals and his advisors, and if he had built more fighter planes earlier in the war, not spent so much of his time and money on the bombers and the B-1 and B-2 rockets.
Having gone through the cupola over there in northern France, along the coast where they did launch the B-1s and B-2s from, and the professionalism that they displayed over there, I think that just with those instruments they could have won that war if they'd had 6 months more of time.